today we are covering the female reproductive system. So first off, the female reproductive system is more complex than the male, and that's because it has more to do. Not only does it produce and deliver gametes, but it provides nutrition and a safe harbor for fetal development. And then that baby is born, so that it also gives birth and then must nourish the infant. So as we saw in the male reproductive system, that's basically just the gametes, the production of gametes and then the deliverance of them. Whereas in the female reproductive system, we see not only the production and maturation of a gamete, but actually the growth of the fetal development within that reproductive system. So there's a lot more to talk about with the female system. The female system is more cyclic, and the hormones are secreted in a more complex sequence than the relatively steady secretion in the male. And this has to do, obviously, with the menstruation cycle, which we are not going to talk about today, but we will, because obviously the woman menstruates once a month. And depending on the time of the month, she may be more fertile than other times of the month, okay? So just a lot going on here in the woman's reproductive system. Okay, the female gonads that produce the egg cells, or the ova, and the sex hormones are called ovaries. They are almond-shaped and nestled in what we call the ovarian fossa. It is a depression in the posterior pelvic wall. There is also a tunica albuginea, which is a capsule, just like we saw on the testes. There is an outer cortex of the ovary, and this is where the germ cells actually develop. There is an inner medulla, which is occupied by major arteries and veins. And the ovaries lacked ducts. So instead, each egg develops in its own fluid-filled follicle. And ovulation is the bursting of that follicle and the releasing of the egg. There are ovarian ligaments, and these are attached to the uterus. They are also attached to the pelvic wall by the suspensory ligament. And these contain the ovarian artery, vein, and nerves. And they are anchored to the broad ligament by the mesoovarium. The ovaries receive blood from two different arteries, an ovarian branch of the uterine artery and an ovarian artery, which is equivalent to the testicular artery that we find in the male. Okay, then we have an ovarian and a uterine artery that are anastomosae along the margin of the ovary, which means it's a special kind of connection. And here, there are multiple small arteries that are given off that enter the ovary. The ovarian veins and lymphatics and nerves also travel through the suspensory ligaments. Okay, then we have the uterine tubes. The uterine tube, or the oviduct, or the fallopian tube. This is a canal about 10 centimeters long from the ovary to the uterus. It is a muscular tube lined with ciliated cells that are highly folded into longitudinal ridges. And those cilia kind of help the egg get to the uterus. They're like little finger projections, right? The major portions are the infundibulum, the fimbriae, the ampulla, the isthmus, and the mesosalpinx. First, the infundibulum is a flared trumpet-shaped distal end. Then we have the fimbriae, and these are feathery projections on the infundibulum. You can see them here in the picture on the very ends. The ampulla is the middle and the longest part, so that is in the center. And then if we are looking at the left side of this picture, next to it, towards the right, going towards the uterus, is the isthmus, and this is the narrower end toward the uterus. And the mesosalpinx is the superior portion of the broad ligament that enfolds in the uterine tube. So all these things are shown here on this picture, and those are their definitions. Then you have the actual uterus. So we've had the ovary, we've had the duct, and now we have the uterus. This is a thick muscular chamber that opens into the roof of the vagina. It usually tilts forward over the urinary bladder. It harbors the fetus. It provides a source of nutrition and expels the fetus at the end of its development. This is where the baby grows. It is a pear-shaped organ, with the fundus being the broad superior curvature, the body or corpus being the middle portion, and the cervix being the cylindrical inferior end. The lumen is kind of like a triangle, and the upper two corners are openings to the uterine tube. And the lower apex is internal. It is not a hollow cavity, but a potential space in a non-pregnant uterus. There is a cervical canal, and this connects the lumen to the vagina. The internal os is a superior opening of the canal into the body of the uterus. The external os is an inferior opening of the canal into the vagina. There are cervical glands, and these secrete mucus that prevents the spread of microorganisms from the vagina to the uterus. The perimetrium is the external serosa layer. The myometrium is the middle muscular layer, and this constitutes most of the uterine wall, and it is made up mainly of smooth muscle. These muscles sweep downwards from the fundus and spiral around the body of the cervix, of the uterus, And then it is less muscular and more fibrous near the cervix. And this muscle actually produces the labor contractions, which help expel or push out the fetus during labor. And then there is the endometrium, and this is the inner mucosa. This is composed of simple columnar epithelium, and it contains compound tubular glands and a stroma populated with leukocytes, macrophages, and other cells. There is a stratum functionalis, which is the superficial half, which is shed during each menstrual period. And then there is the stratum basalis, which is the deeper layer, which stays behind and regenerates a new stratum functionalis with each menstrual cycle. During pregnancy, the endometrium is the site of attachment of the embryo and forms the maternal part of the placenta from which the fetus will then be nourished. The uterus is supported by the muscular floor of the pelvic outlet and folds of the peritoneum that form ligaments around the organ. The broad ligament has two parts, the mesocephalus and the mesometrium on each side of the uterus. The cardinal lateral cervical ligaments support the cervix and the superior part of the vagina extending to the pelvic wall. There are also uterosacral ligaments, and they are paired and attached posterior to the posterior side of the uterus to the sacrum. There are round ligaments, and they are paired and arise from the anterior surface of the uterus. They pass through the inguinal canals and terminate in the labia majoris. Much like the gubernaculum, which terminates in the male scrotum. Most things are mirrored in the male and the female. They're just a little different. All right, the uterine blood supply is important to the menstrual cycle and to pregnancy. There is a uterine artery, which arises from each internal iliac artery. And it travels and gives off several branches that penetrate the myometrium. We need the uterus to be highly vascularized because, again, it is growing a potential person. The uterine artery leads to arcuate arteries, and each of these travels in a circle around the uterus. And they are anastomose with arcuate artery on the other side, meaning a connection. The spiral arteries penetrate through the myometrium into the endometrium. They wind between the endometrial glands toward the surface of the mucosa. They rhythmically constrict and dilate, making the mucosa alternatively blanch and flush with blood. Again, keeping it innervated with a constant blood supply. Then we have the vagina, the birth canal, 8 to 10 centimeters of muscular tube. It allows for the discharge of menstrual fluid. It is the recipient of the penis and semen, and it is the delivery channel for the baby. And there is an outer invertita, a middle muscularis, and an inner mucosa. It is tilted posteriorly between the rectum and the urethra. It has no glands. Transudation, which lubricates the vagina, sometimes called vaginal sweating, is a serous fluid it's basically this serous fluid comes through its walls and by a mucus from the cervical gland, which is above it, because it itself does not have glands, the vagina. The fornices are blind-ended spaces formed by the vagina that is extending slightly beyond the cervix. And then there is a transverse friction ridge, or the vaginal rugae, at the lower end. There are also what are called, there are mucosal folds that form what we call the hymen, which lies across the vaginal opening. The vaginal epithelium. In childhood, it is simple cuboidal tissue. But during puberty, estrogens transform this simple cuboidal epithelium to stratified squamous endothelium. And bacteria ferment the glycogen-rich cells, producing acidic pH in the vagina. The vagina itself is a bit acidic. This is an example of what we call metaplasia, which is the transformation of one tissue type to another. Because as we said, the tissue actually changes from simple cuboidal epithelium to stratified squamous epithelium. Then we also have antigen-presenting dendritic cells, and this is the route by which HIV from an infected semen could invade the female body. It is through those dendritic cells. Okay, then we have some external genitalia, and they are collectively called the vulva and the pendendum. The mons pubis is the mound of fat over the pubic symphysis, bearing most of the pubic hair. There is then a labia majora and minora. The majora are a pair of thick folds of skin and adipose tissue inferior to the mons. The pendineal cleft is the slit between the labia majora. The labia minora are medial, meaning closer inside to the labia majora, and they are thin, hairless folds. That is the space between that forms the vestibule, which contains urethral and vaginal openings. So this is within the labia, and this is where the two openings of the female reproductive and urinary system are. And then the anterior margins of the labia minora join to form hood-like prepuce over the clitoris. So this is all within that area, but it is external to the body. The clitoris is an erectile sensory organ with no urinary role. It is basically the primary center for erotic stimulation. And it has what's called the glans, body, and crurua. Those are the three spots of it. Then you have the vestibular bulbs, and these are erectile tissue that are deep to the labia majora. They cause the vagina to tighten around the penis, which enhances sexual stimulation. And then there are the greater and lesser vestibular and paraurethral glands that open into the vestibule for lubrication. Females and males both have mammary glands, but women, for the most part, have breast. And this is a mound of tissue overlying the pectoralis major, which is the muscle underneath. It enlarges at puberty and remains so for life. Most of the time, it contains very little actual mammary gland. It's usually adipose tissue. The mammary gland develops within the breast when someone is pregnant and remains active in the lactating breast. It then atrophies or diminishes when a woman ceases to nurse. So you're only lactating usually if you are nursing a baby. Two principal regions of the breast are the body, which is conical to the pendulus, with the nipple at its apex. So the breast, they're saying, is kind of conical, like a cone. And then the axillary tail is the extension toward the armpit. And here we find the lymphatics, which are in your armpit there, in the axillary tail, and they are important as a route for breast cancer metastasis. Now, we're not going to get into that today, but because they are so close, sometimes if you have breast cancer and it metastasizes, the first place you see it, or the next place you see it, is in the lymphatics in the armpit, because it's so close to the breast, and it then can break off and travel into the lymph system. You have a nipple, which is surrounded by the circular colored zone, which we call the areola. And this is because the blood capillaries and nerves are closer to the skin surface, and therefore the areola is more sensitive. Sensory nerve fibers of the areola trigger the milk ejection reflex when an infant nurses. The areolar glands are intermediate between sweat glands and mammary glands. The secretions protect the nipple from chapping and cracking during nursing. There are also smooth muscle fibers in the dermis of the areola that contract in response to cold, touch, and sexual arousal. There's a wrinkling of the skin and an erecting of the nipple. In the non-lactating breast, it consists mostly of adipose and collagen fibers or tissue. The breast size is determined by the amount of adipose tissue. As I mentioned before, it's really not, the majority of the breast is not mammary gland, it's adipose tissue. There are also suspensory ligaments that attach the breast to the dermis of the overlying skin and the fascia of the pectoralis major, which, as we mentioned, was the muscle underneath the breast. There is a system of ducts branching through the fibrous stroma and converging on the nipple. Mammary glands develop during pregnancy, and there are about 15 to 20 lobes around the nipple. The lactiferous duct drains each lobe, and it dilates to form the lactiferous sinus, which opens into the nipple. And that brings us to the conclusion of this lecture. Lots of terms, lots of new information. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a wonderful day. Thanks.